They thought it was just a shadow in the snow. At first, it looked like a drift or a fallen branch buried under white, half lost in the storm that had swallowed everything in sight. But as the wind howled and the snow whipped harder, that shape didn't shift or disappear. It stayed still, too still. Jake was the first to notice. A grizzled rancher with 40 winters behind him, he'd seen a lot out in these parts, but something about this shape felt wrong. He eased his truck to a crawl along the fence line, eyes squinting through the frost-coated windshield, heart thudding with a sense he couldn't quite explain. Tom and Miguel, sitting in the cab beside him, were silent, alert, but it was Miguel who finally broke it, pointing sharply through the whiteout and shouting, "There! Something's down!" Jake hit the brakes, the truck sliding slightly on the icy dirt. All three men leaned forward, breath fogging the inside of the glass. There, just ahead, lay a dark form barely distinguishable from the snow-covered ground around it. They got out. The cold slapped them instantly, sharp as broken glass. Snow bit at their faces, the wind roaring across the open desert. Even bundled in thick coats and hats, the chill sank straight through. Every sound was muffled, swallowed by the storm, but the silence around that figure felt even heavier. They moved slowly, instinctively cautious. These were men who knew what the wild could do, what it meant to find an animal out here during a storm. Jake led, his boots crunching through snow that rose nearly to his knees in places, eyes locked on the unmoving figure ahead. As they drew closer, details sharpened. A body, large, powerful, and unmistakably equine. A horse. A wild Mustang by the look of it, black-coated, though now layered in a powder of white from the relentless snow. He was lying on his side, legs oddly bent beneath him, neck stretched across the frozen earth like he'd collapsed mid-stride. But he was breathing. Shallow, visible puffs of breath curled upward, the only sign of life in that frozen frame. Jake halted just a few feet away, frowning. Something didn't make sense. Injured or not, a wild Mustang doesn't just lie still like this when humans approach. They fight, they run. Even in pain, they don't simply lie down and wait. But this one hadn't moved an inch. His sides rose and fell with a labored rhythm, and yet his eyes were wide open, locked onto the men with an eerie kind of focus. Not panic, not fear, something else, something colder, more primal. He wasn't unconscious. He was choosing to stay down. That was the first thing that made the hairs rise on Jake's arms. Miguel crouched beside him, trying to assess the stallion's condition from a safe distance. He'd grown up with horses, understood their signals better than most. "He's not just hurt," he said slowly, the words almost lost to the wind. "Look at his posture. He's holding himself still, deliberately, like he's guarding something." That's when Jake saw it too, just a slight shift in the snow beneath the horse, a depression that didn't match his body's shape. The snow around him was disturbed, not by random struggle, but by something more controlled. The Mustang was covering something, not lying where he fell, but where he chose to fall. Jake took a careful step closer, the wind tugging at his coat. The stallion's ears twitched, his body tensing just slightly. His eyes met Jake's again, and in that unblinking stare was something the old rancher would never forget. Determination, pain, and a warning. This wasn't just an animal downed by winter. This was a sentinel, a protector, and whatever he was hiding beneath his own failing body was the reason he hadn't moved, hadn't run, hadn't even tried to defend himself. The storm raged around them, screaming across the empty desert, And yet, in that moment, all three men stood still, not from cold, but from a growing, terrible sense that they were standing on the edge of something far more important than they'd ever expected. They had come looking for cattle. Instead, they had found a mystery buried in snow, and what lay beneath that horse, still hidden, was about to change everything. Jake moved in a slow circle around the fallen Mustang, boots crunching through crusted snow, his breath visible in sharp clouds as he examined the scene from every angle. The stallion didn't move, didn't so much as flinch, but his eyes followed Jake's every step. They were dark, glossy, and filled with something far deeper than fear. There was intelligence behind them and purpose. The horse was weak, anyone could see that, but he was not broken, not yet. He was holding his ground. That was clear, and he was doing it for a reason that none of them fully understood. Miguel crouched again, studying the horse's body position more carefully now. "He's not collapsed from just injury," he muttered, more to himself than the others. "He's bracing. Look at the way his legs are folded. They're not sprawled like he lost consciousness. He's holding himself like that, deliberately." Tom, standing a few feet away, glanced at Jake, concern etched across his weathered face. But why? What could he be hiding out here? Jake didn't answer, not right away. His gut told him they were missing something critical, and then he saw it. At first, it was just a shift in the snow beneath the horse's flank, a slight dip in the white powder that shouldn't have been there, not part of the horse's shape. A small impression, almost symmetrical, as if something lay curled directly under the stallion's ribcage. Jake narrowed his eyes, kneeling slightly, brushing a gloved hand gently across the snow near the stallion's side, but not touching him. The horse tensed instantly, not lifting his head, but giving a low, guttural sound deep in his throat. It wasn't quite a whinny, not a growl, something between defiance and despair, a sound that made the air feel colder. "Back up," Jake said quietly, stepping away with hands raised. "He's guarding something. I don't think it's just instinct either. This is intentional." Miguel nodded slowly, still crouched in the snow. "Whatever's under him, he's not letting it go. Not unless he's sure we're not a threat." The snow continued to swirl around them, clinging to everything, falling fast enough to erase footprints within minutes. The Mustang's body was now frosted over, his black coat dulled to gray beneath the storm's steady assault. And still he didn't move, didn't shift, didn't blink. Only the quick rise and fall of his sides gave away how much effort it was taking for him to stay like that. The stallion was freezing, bleeding, and exhausted beyond words, but he refused to leave his post. Tom's voice was tight. "He's not just laying here to die. He's choosing to stay. He's protecting something." That single realization shifted the entire mood. They weren't dealing with a simple rescue anymore. They were intruding on something sacred, a stand, a sacrifice. Miguel stepped forward cautiously, his tone soft, using the calm rhythm he'd learned on his family's ranch, words not meant to control but to soothe. "Easy, viejo, tranquilo. We're not here to take anything from you." The stallion's ears flicked, but stayed flat, his muscles twitching as he fought back another tremor. A thin ribbon of blood trickled from a gash on his hind leg, disappearing into the snow beneath him. The color had started to seep across the ground like ink dropped into water, staining the white with slow, terrible certainty. Jake scanned the area again, looking for tracks, for any sign of what had happened here. And that's when more pieces began falling into place. The snow around the horse had been disturbed, not randomly, but in broad, erratic sweeps, like a fight had taken place. Scattered hoofprints, drag marks, a spatter of frozen blood farther up the ridge. Jake's mind raced. It wasn't just the weather that had brought this horse down. Something had attacked, or chased. The stallion hadn't just stumbled and fallen in the storm. He had fought, and then, instead of fleeing, he had come back, returned to this exact spot to shield whatever lay beneath him. Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind, "I think it's a foal." Jake's heart clenched. It made sense, the size of the impression, the behavior, the way the stallion had frozen like a sentry, not even trying to escape. If there was a foal underneath him, it would be completely dependent, helpless in this weather, and unless they acted soon, both of them would be lost to the cold. But how do you help an animal who's willing to die to protect the one thing he still loves? How do you get close without crossing a line that could send him into panic, or worse, into a final burst of fury that his body couldn't survive? Jake didn't know, not yet. But what he did know, deep in his bones, was that this Mustang wasn't just a wild horse. He was something else entirely, a guardian, a father, maybe not by blood, but by choice. And he had chosen to lie down here in the full wrath of a February blizzard to shield a life smaller than his own, a life they still hadn't seen, but now desperately needed to save. The silence between the three men was thick now, the kind of silence that only happens when everyone's realized they're in the presence of something rare, something ancient, something profound. The storm screamed on, the cold deepened, and still the Mustang stayed where he was, protecting whatever was hidden beneath him with everything he had left. The wind rose like a living thing, whipping snow into their faces with blinding fury as Jake took another cautious step forward. The stallion's eyes didn't waver. His head didn't lift. His body didn't shift. He just watched, every muscle taut, every ounce of energy focused on the shape under his belly. Miguel had never seen anything like it, not in all his years growing up on the ranch, not even in the stories passed down by older vaqueros who talked about wild horses like they were legends. This wasn't just a display of strength. This was something else entirely, a choice, a vow, a creature pushed beyond its limits but refusing to break. That's what made it terrifying and beautiful. Jake crouched low now, ignoring the bite of the snow against his knees, eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The depression beneath the stallion was more than just a mark in the snow. It had a shape, small, tight, curled inward, like something had folded in on itself to stay warm. It didn't belong to the stallion's body. It was something else, something alive. Maybe. He leaned closer, just enough to catch a glimpse beneath the stallion's chest, and that's when he heard it. A sound, faint, so soft he almost thought he imagined it, not the howl of wind or the creak of trees. A tiny, muffled whimper, a high-pitched whinny buried under layers of snow and muscle and determination. Jake's eyes widened. He stepped back, breath catching in his throat. "There's something under him," he said, almost in disbelief. "It's alive." Miguel froze, his breath fogging the air. He had heard it too, a soft, desperate sound that didn't belong in this kind of storm. Tom blinked hard, straining to listen. "A foal?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The possibility seemed both impossible and inevitable at the same time. No adult horse could survive lying still in this kind of storm for long, let alone choose to, but to do it to protect a baby, that would take a level of instinct most didn't believe wild horses even had. And yet, here it was, unfolding right in front of them. Jake crouched again, this time moving slower, more deliberately. The stallion's body trembled with visible strain, each breath labored and uneven. Blood still seeped from the gash on his leg, and now Jake could see smaller scratches along his flank and chest. Old wounds, fresh ones, evidence of a struggle, not just with the weather. This horse had fought something, and he had survived long enough to return here. Not for himself, but for the creature beneath him. Miguel inched forward too, murmuring in Spanish, his voice low and calm, a lifeline in the roar of the blizzard. "Está bien, viejo. Tranquilo. No te vamos a hacer daño." The words weren't meant to be understood not by language, but by tone, by rhythm, by intent. The stallion didn't attack. He didn't retreat either. He simply remained, his body a wall, a shield. Miguel glanced at Jake and nodded. It was time. Jake shifted around to the stallion's flank, moving closer to where the shape in the snow was most pronounced. He leaned down, reaching slowly, not to touch, just to brush away some of the snow. A gentle sweep of a gloved hand, tentative, respectful. The stallion grunted again, warning in the sound, but not aggression. That's when Jake saw it. A patch of brown fur, soft and matted, pressed tight against the stallion's belly. Too small to be an adult, too perfectly nestled to be debris. It was a foal. Jake staggered back a step, his voice choked. "It's a baby," he said. "He's been laying on top of a baby this whole time." The realization hit all three of them like a hammer. The stallion wasn't just enduring the storm. He wasn't just guarding the foal. He was sheltering it, his body wrapped around it like armor. Every ounce of warmth he had left was being funneled into the tiny life tucked beneath him. That's why he hadn't moved. That's why he'd risked everything to stay here, broken and bleeding, in the middle of nowhere. Because he was trying to keep the foal alive. The weight of it settled heavily in the air, heavier than the snow. Tom rubbed his face, overwhelmed. "He must have tracked it down after it got separated," he said quietly. "Maybe the herd scattered in the storm. Maybe there was an attack, but instead of running, he came back for it." Miguel's eyes didn't leave the foal. And then he laid down, on purpose, to keep it warm, to keep it from dying. None of them spoke for a long moment. The wind screamed, and the snow swirled, and the world around them felt like it had shrunk down to this one impossible thing. A stallion, half dead, clinging to life not for himself, but for a foal that wasn't his by blood, but maybe was by heart. There were no words for what they were witnessing, only the raw, primal truth that some creatures are built to protect, even when it costs them everything. Jake swallowed hard, voice hoarse. "If we don't act fast, we're gonna lose them both." But they all knew the stakes. One wrong move could panic the stallion, cost precious body heat, break the delicate line between life and death for the baby below. Every second they waited was another drop of temperature, another moment closer to the end. But rushing in without care might be worse. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a negotiation with a dying horse who had made a vow, a creature who had chosen, with everything in him, to give up his own survival in exchange for one last chance to save a life smaller than his own. And now it was up to them to prove they were worthy of the trust he hadn't yet given. Miguel's breath came faster now, fogging in front of him with each exhale as he knelt down again, inches from the stallion's flank. He didn't reach for the foal. He didn't even move closer. He just looked, steady and soft, trying to gauge the shape pressed beneath the stallion's body. The foal's coat, brown, damp, matted with snow, was barely visible through the tangle of legs and the heaving of the stallion's ribs. But it was enough to see that it was small. Still. Not dead, not yet, but clearly close. Its ears didn't twitch, its chest barely moved. It was buried under weight, under snow, under a storm that didn't care whether it took one life or two. And above it all, the stallion refused to move, refused to break, even though it was obvious he was on the edge of collapse himself. Jake stood up and backed off, hands on his hips, eyes scanning the open stretch of white that surrounded them like an ocean. There was no sign of the herd, no mother searching for her baby, no tracks except for the chaos left behind in the fight, hoof prints scattered like puzzle pieces, bloodstains frozen in time, claw marks gouged into the crusted snow. The old horse hadn't just gotten injured, he had fought. Jake could see it now. Something had attacked, maybe a predator or maybe just the cold and wild itself, but this stallion hadn't fled. He had turned around, he had found the foal, and he had given himself to the snow to keep it breathing. Miguel said quietly, "If we move him too fast, we might kill the baby, and if we don't move him at all..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The truth was as clear as the cold in their bones. Time was running out, and every minute that passed, the foal's body grew colder, its heartbeat slower. The stallion's wounds weren't just superficial anymore. Jake could see it now. His lips were pale and dry, his eyes losing clarity, that shimmer of intelligence fading to fog. The horse was slipping, fast. Tom finally spoke up, his voice tight, low, the sound of a man calculating a risk he didn't want to take. "We need gear. We've got the thermal blankets, the rope kit, the first aid box in the truck. That might buy us a little time. But we can't load them both in the truck, not like this. The foal can't move. And the stallion won't let us near her unless we do this right." Jake nodded slowly. "Get the supplies, but no fast movements, no shouting. We're not just helping a horse. We're walking into a situation where one wrong move ends 2 lives." Tom didn't hesitate. He turned and jogged back to the truck, slipping slightly as the snow grabbed at his boots. The wind whipped harder across the plain now, stinging their skin, screaming through the fences and trees like a warning. Miguel leaned forward, just an inch closer, still murmuring in that soft, measured tone. "We're not taking her from you, viejo," he said. "We're trying to help. You're not alone." Jake crouched again on the opposite side, now working out the details in his head. Moving a full-grown stallion who was injured, freezing, and fully alert to danger was already risky. Doing it when he was literally lying on top of a newborn? That was another level of delicate. They couldn't spook him. They couldn't force him. The only hope they had was to earn his trust. If not completely, then just enough for him to shift. Just enough to let them slip a warming blanket over the foal. Maybe get some body heat back into her frame. Maybe start stabilizing the stallion's bleeding before it drained him further. When Tom returned, arms full with a stack of supplies, blankets, emergency wraps, the grain feed, antiseptic, and the red-latched first aid box, Jake gave him a slow nod. "Lay out the grain, not close, a little ways off, just enough to tempt him. Let him smell it." Tom did as instructed, spreading a thin trail of sweet feed across the snow in a careful arc. The scent, even against the wind, made the stallion's nostrils flare. His head twitched, neck muscles tightening. A flicker of awareness sparked again in his eyes. Hunger battling instinct, survival warring with duty. But he didn't move. Miguel smiled softly. "He's thinking about it," he said. "He's starving, but the foal comes first." Jake knelt again, this time holding one of the warming blankets. He didn't approach. He didn't wave it. He simply sat with it in his lap, letting the stallion see it, smell it, understand that nothing about this moment was a threat. And then, as if the universe decided they had waited long enough, the stallion made his move. It wasn't dramatic. There was no collapse, no wild motion, no panic, just a slow shift. He adjusted his front leg slightly, then the other. His body lifted by a few precious inches, just enough to expose a sliver more of the foal beneath him. And that was all Jake needed. He moved in fast but careful, sliding the blanket under the exposed side of the foal, wrapping what he could without displacing the stallion. Miguel mirrored his movements on the other side. The foal didn't resist, didn't have the strength to resist. Her head lolled slightly, eyes half-lidded, breath slow. But it was there. "She's alive," Miguel whispered. "But not for long if we don't warm her now." Jake's hands worked quickly, fingers numb but precise. They tucked the edges of the blanket around her fragile legs, insulated her sides, tried to create a bubble of warmth between her and the snow. And through it all, the stallion didn't stop them. His breathing was ragged, his body shaking, but he let them do it, because somehow, some way, he knew they were trying to save her. But time wasn't their friend. The foal's breathing remained shallow. The stallion's blood still soaked into the snow in slow, steady drops. And above them, the storm didn't care. It kept howling, kept falling, as if daring them to try and win this battle. Jake stood up and looked down at the stallion, locking eyes again. "You've done your part," he said under his breath. "Now let us do ours." He didn't expect the horse to understand the words, but part of him hoped the meaning, the promise, would carry through anyway, because the moment of decision was coming, fast. And if they were going to keep these two souls alive, this broken protector and the tiny life still tucked beneath him, they had to act now. There wouldn't be another chance. The grain lay scattered in a thin trail, the flakes of sweet feed slowly sinking into the snow, growing damp under the relentless weight of the storm. But the scent was strong, unmistakable, an aroma any horse would recognize even through the sharp sting of wind and blood. The stallion's nostrils flared again, wider this time. His ears twitched, his body gave a slight, involuntary shudder, not from fear, but from fatigue. Hunger had begun to dig its claws in. He was starving, that much was obvious. Yet still, he stayed perfectly still, curled around the foal like a statue sculpted out of desperation and instinct. Jake watched him, waiting, breath tight in his chest. The stallion's eyes weren't as sharp now. The glaze had returned, a milky haze creeping into that fierce, defiant stare. But the awareness was still there. The fight. He was still choosing to stay, still willing to freeze to death in order to be her barrier against the storm. Jake had never seen anything like it. In 4 decades of ranching, he'd broken Mustangs, lost calves, faced wild predators, and once helped pull a baby from a mother cow in a thunderstorm with nothing but a flashlight and a prayer. But nothing had ever prepared him for this. This wasn't just survival, this was sacrifice. Miguel, crouching at the foal's side, had both hands on the warming blanket now, pressing it gently against the baby's ribs. He didn't try to move her, just insulate her, hold the heat in as best he could. Her breathing was so faint now that he had to press his ear close to her chest just to be sure it was still there. "She's hanging on," he said, eyes locked with Jake's, the words trembling. "But we're out of time. She's slipping." Tom came up behind them, holding one of the backup emergency kits. Inside were heat packs, small chemical ones meant for hikers or stranded motorists. Not ideal for foals, but it was all they had. "We can warm her from both sides," he said quickly. "Tuck these under the blanket. Maybe buy her an hour, maybe less. Enough to stabilize her while we figure out the next move." Jake nodded, already unsealing the packs. His fingers were numb, clumsy, but his movements were practiced, quick, desperate. Then something shifted, a sound. The snow muffled it, but they all heard it. A scraping, a grunt, a strained exhale. The stallion moved. Not much, just a few inches, but it was enough. Enough to uncoil his body slightly, to shift the weight off the foal's back legs. Enough for them to fully see her, tiny, fragile, barely more than a few weeks old. Her legs were tucked beneath her belly, her muzzle resting limply in the snow. The warmth of her breath formed a shallow indent beneath her nose, fading fast. But the exposure, the movement, meant something. Jake leaned in, watching the stallion with narrowed eyes. "He knows," he muttered. "He knows she needs more than he can give now." The stallion's flanks were rising and falling faster now, his breathing more ragged. Blood had begun to soak through the blanket they'd laid over him earlier. His body was failing. But even in his exhaustion, even as his eyes dimmed, he was still aware enough to shift just enough so they could help. He was letting go, just a little, enough to give them access. Miguel took that opening, gently sliding the heat packs under the foal's side, adjusting the blanket without lifting her. Every movement calculated to preserve what little strength she had left. The stallion didn't lash out, didn't growl or whinny. He watched, and Jake could have sworn maybe it was the cold or the emotion pressing down on him, but he thought the stallion gave a nod, just barely, as if to say, "I'm trusting you." Tom spread more grain, this time closer, just a few feet away. The stallion's eyes flickered toward it. His body gave a twitch, part instinct, part need. He hadn't eaten in who knew how long. His stomach was likely empty, cramping with hunger. But still, he didn't rise. He didn't abandon the foal. Jake took a step forward, pulling another small trick from his coat, a cracked apple, half frozen but sweet. He knelt, rolled it gently across the snow. It came to rest right at the stallion's front hooves. A pause, then a miracle. The stallion shifted again. His head dropped, muzzle stretching forward with trembling effort. He sniffed the apple, jaw twitching. Then, slowly, he took it, bit into it, chewed, swallowed. It was the first thing he'd accepted from them, the first real sign that he saw them as something other than danger. Miguel's voice was barely audible now, but still steady. "There you go, viejo. Come on. You've done enough. Let us take care of her." The stallion raised his head again, eyes still fixed on the foal. His ears turned, listening to the soft, shallow breaths. She stirred slightly, just a flicker of movement, enough to let them know she was still fighting. Jake motioned to Tom. "Get the tarp. We need to make a windbreak, right here. He's not going to move far, and she can't be carried yet, so we bring the shelter to them." Tom nodded and ran back toward the truck. They didn't have a proper tent, but they had what they needed. Thick tarps, poles, rope, enough to throw together a 3-wall shield against the wind and hold off the storm, if only for a little while longer. Jake turned his attention back to the stallion. He wasn't moving now, just breathing, just watching, his eyes on Miguel and the foal, on Jake and the feed, as if he were doing his own calculations. Could they be trusted? Could they finish what he'd started? Could he finally, after all this, stop fighting? And that was when Jake understood. This wasn't about saving a foal anymore. This was about honoring a choice. The stallion had made his. He'd returned. He'd laid down. He'd given everything he had left to shield her from the storm. And now what little strength remained in him wasn't to survive. It was to watch, to make sure the hands reaching for her were steady, that their voices were calm, that their intentions were good. He wasn't letting go until he saw for himself that she was safe. Only then would he rest. Jake felt the lump rise in his throat, sharp and sudden. He swallowed it down and stepped closer, just near enough to place a hand on the stallion's shoulder. The coat was coarse, damp, trembling beneath his touch. "You've done good," Jake whispered. "You held on. Now let us do the rest." The stallion didn't flinch. He didn't move, but something passed between them, something ancient, something wordless. And for the first time since they'd arrived, Jake no longer felt like a stranger. He felt like a witness, like a partner in something far bigger than any of them had expected when they set out that morning. They had come searching for cattle. They had found a story of survival and love that defied everything they thought they knew about wild creatures. And now, with the shelter rising, the blankets warming, and the foal still breathing, the real work was just beginning. The wind howled like it had lost its mind, screaming across the open land with nothing to stop it. Snow whipped sideways, biting through layers of clothing, blinding the men as they struggled with the tarp, the ropes catching in frozen fingers. They worked in practiced silence, every movement efficient, every knot tied with purpose, driven not by urgency alone, but by something deeper, an unspoken understanding that they were racing the clock against a storm and against death. The stallion hadn't moved again since accepting the apple, hadn't made another sound, but his chest still rose and fell in slow, labored rhythm. And the foal, tiny, wrapped in blankets and heat packs, remained tucked against his flank, her breathing faint but steady. Time wasn't just short now. It was bleeding out with every second they wasted. Jake grunted as he drove a stake into the frozen ground, his arms aching from the cold and the strain. Tom held the tarp taut as Miguel ran the final rope through the last grommet, pulling it tight. Together they constructed a crude 3-sided windbreak, using the side of the truck as the fourth wall and the stallion's position as the heart of the shelter. It wasn't much, flapping walls of nylon and cord, anchored with tools and fence posts, but it held. It stopped the worst of the wind, dulled the roar of the storm just enough to give them a pocket of quiet. Inside that space, the air was still freezing, but less brutal, less deadly, and that was enough. The makeshift shelter formed a crescent around the stallion and the foal, with enough room for the men to crouch or kneel and to continue their work. The cold no longer tore at their eyes quite as viciously. Their voices, when they spoke, didn't vanish into the gale. Jake looked at the stallion again, his eyes narrowing. The horse hadn't made a move since they'd built the shelter around him, and Jake couldn't decide whether that was good or terrifying. His body was still curled protectively, but now more loosely, as though he were slowly relaxing, not from comfort, but from the final edge of exhaustion. His eyes had lost their sharpness. His head drooped slightly, but he was still watching, still alert, if only barely. His duty was almost done, and he knew it. Miguel slid next to the foal, checked the heat packs, adjusted the blanket again. He pressed 2 fingers gently against her neck, feeling for a pulse. She was alive, but weak. "She's cold all the way to the bone," he said quietly, his voice dry and low. "But she's not gone. She's fighting. So is he. But they're both out of time. We need more than blankets. We need shelter, real shelter, and heat." Tom looked over. "We can't move them. The foal can't even stand. And if we try to lift her, she'll go into shock," Miguel said. "Or worse." Jake nodded slowly, thinking through every possibility. They didn't have a barn, no outpost. The closest proper shelter was the ranch, over 30 miles away, through frozen land, icy roads, and terrain too rough for transport in this storm. The foal wouldn't survive the trip. The stallion definitely wouldn't, not like this. Even loading them into the back of the truck was out of the question. Every jostle would be pain, every bump a risk. Moving them was a death sentence, so that meant only one thing. "We build," Jake said, his voice steady. "We don't move them. We build around them, here now." Tom's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "I'm not waiting for a miracle," Jake said. "This is it. We dig in, we make this space safe, and we keep them alive until someone can get to us." Miguel looked between them. "We'll need more than tarps. That truck's got the emergency tent. It's small but insulated. We can pitch it right over them, leave the flaps open, make sure we don't trap them, but at least stop the wind. There's a battery pack, too, for heat." Jake nodded. "Go." Minutes later, the tent was up, barely big enough to kneel in, but lined with reflective insulation, thick plastic, and thermal layers meant for mountain survival. Tom and Miguel worked together to slide the structure over the 2 horses, anchoring it to the ground with snow stakes and bungees. It looked absurd, a tiny bubble of life in the middle of a frozen wasteland, but once it was closed, it began to hold warmth. Not much, but enough to stop the worst of the cold. Inside, the foal was placed in a soft, insulated nest of blankets, now resting completely separate from the snow. The stallion remained by her side, his legs curled beneath him, head resting low. And then something happened. The foal stirred. Not much, just a twitch of the ear, a tiny flicker of her eyelid, but it was enough to send a jolt through the 3 men. Miguel leaned in. "She's waking up," he whispered. "She's coming back." The stallion responded immediately. A soft, broken sound escaped his chest. Not a whinny, not a grunt, a low, trembling noise that carried more meaning than any words. He lowered his head further, pressed his muzzle gently against her side. The baby shifted, let out a faint, breathy whimper, and then, miraculously, her mouth moved. She reached upward, nuzzling the stallion's neck. It was the first full movement they'd seen from her, and it changed everything. Jake watched in awe, barely able to speak. That foal should have been dead hours ago, if not for him. Miguel shook his head. He gave her every last bit of warmth he had. Tom stepped closer, holding a thermos in one hand, the other clutching a bottle filled with the emergency milk replacer. "I can try feeding her," he said. "If she takes it, we've got a chance." Jake nodded. Carefully, no sudden moves. Miguel held the foal steady as Tom placed the rubber nipple near her mouth. The stallion tensed slightly but didn't intervene. After a moment's hesitation, the foal suckled. Weakly, slowly, but she drank. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was recovery. They stayed like that for hours, working in silence, taking shifts, checking wounds, monitoring temperature, adjusting the tent, keeping the stallion calm. And though the stallion never left the foal's side, never stood, never made a sound beyond that one soft exhale, they could see it in him. He knew. He knew she had crossed the threshold. She was no longer dying. She was healing. She would live. And slowly, without a word, he began to let go. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the soft sag of his neck, the slackening of his jaw, the way his breath began to slow. Jake placed a hand on his shoulder again, the gesture no longer about control or contact. It was respect, gratitude, understanding. This horse had done something no human could have done. In a storm that would have claimed both their lives, he had turned himself into a shelter. He had become the tenth, the blanket, the wall, and now his mission was complete. As dawn began to edge into the sky behind the storm, light pale and cold and distant, Jake looked at the tent they'd built, at the makeshift camp carved out of snow and a faith and refusal to quit. He looked at the foal, now asleep but no longer still, and he looked at the stallion, who had not moved but no longer looked like he was alone. He wasn't, not anymore. It was Tom who noticed it first, a sharp glint just beneath the layer of snow near where the stallion had first collapsed. He was gathering the last of the supply bags, moving slowly, trying not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over the tent and the horses inside. The wind had quieted slightly, giving them the briefest moment of reprieve. As he stooped to pick up a dropped thermos, something caught the edge of his eye, a sliver of worn leather poking up from the snow like a piece of buried treasure. He brushed it aside, clearing away a thin crust of ice, and what he uncovered made his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't just debris, it was a pouch, hand-stitched, weathered, old but intact. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his gloved hands. It was too well made to have belonged to a hiker, and inside he could feel something solid, flat, paper-thin, and plastic. He called out to Jake and Miguel, who were still huddled near the tent entrance, monitoring the stallion and the foal. Jake turned first, eyes narrowing as he caught the seriousness in Tom's tone. Miguel joined them as Tom held the pouch open, revealing its contents. Inside was a laminated tag, some folded papers, and what looked like a GPS tracking device, long since deactivated. Jake took the documents and unfolded them slowly, his fingers shaking from both the cold and a growing sense that this moment meant more than they understood yet. The name on the top of the page stopped him cold. Ghost Walker. He read it aloud, the words barely a whisper, more like a thought escaping into the wind. Miguel looked up, startled. "Wait, that name. I've heard it before. Back home, people talk about a wild Mustang out here, black as night, smarter than most ranch horses, one that shows up during the worst winters and disappears like a ghost in the spring. They say he's different, that he watches, guards, like he's more than just a stallion. Jake kept reading. The papers were field reports, observations from wildlife biologists, complete with dates, coordinates, and handwritten notes. Ghostwalker had been monitored for over 8 years. The notes were clear, detailed, even reverent in tone. They described a stallion who had been documented doing something almost no wild male ever did: adopting orphaned foals, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. He'd been spotted leading them through mountain passes, standing between them and predators, even circling back to protect them during stampedes. And now it seemed he had done it again. Here, now, one last time. Miguel's face tightened as he realized what they were holding. He's not just any wild horse. He's known, and that foal... He paused, looking back toward the tent, toward the small blanketed form resting against the stallion's side. She's not just some stray. She's the daughter of his lead mare, Stormcloud. That's what it says here. Stormcloud, killed 2 days ago in a confirmed cougar attack. This foal, she's hers. Jake felt something crack open in his chest. All at once the pieces fell into place. The claw marks on Ghostwalker's hide, the blood trail, the stallion's refusal to move, his willingness to die in the snow. It hadn't been chance. It had been love. Not the kind that's born of instinct alone, but the kind that remembers, that hurts, that fights back. The kind that doesn't ask if survival is possible, only whether it's worth giving everything for someone else. He hadn't stumbled on the foal. He had sought her out. After losing his mare, maybe the last companion he had found her daughter, her legacy, and done what no one expected him to do. He stayed. He didn't run. He didn't rejoin the herd or seek shelter or lick his wounds. He laid down in the snow, placed his battered body over hers, and gave her everything he had left: heat, protection, time, a chance. And now Jake realized he had done it again, just like the biologists had recorded, just like the legends said. Ghostwalker had once more stood between the wild and the helpless, the predator and the prey, the cold and the innocent. Tom, who had remained silent for several minutes, now spoke quietly. "He's 22 years old. That's ancient for a wild stallion. The notes say he's been declining, slower than he used to be, losing fights, falling behind the herd." Miguel looked up from the foal, voice thick. He knew. The words were like stone. He knew he didn't have many winters left. He knew this one might be his last, and he spent it saving her. Jake felt tears sting his eyes, but he didn't look away. He stared at the stallion, who still hadn't moved, who still lay curled beside the foal, his breaths slow, measured, but growing weaker by the hour. "He chose to die out here," Jake said, "but not before making sure she'd live." The wind outside the top broke again into a long, low moan. The sun, hidden behind a curtain of gray, began to slide toward the far horizon. The light was dimming, but inside the small circle of warmth they'd built, the truth burned bright. Ghostwalker wasn't just a horse. He was a story, a guardian, a symbol of something they rarely got to see in its purest form, a creature who loved without condition, who gave without expectation, who stood against the wild not for dominance, but for compassion. Miguel whispered, "We're not just saving her. We're carrying out his last act." And that was when they made a silent agreement, all 3 of them, without words, without ceremony. They would not let his sacrifice be for nothing. They would stay. They would keep building, keep warming, keep feeding until help could arrive. They would bear witness, not just to survival, but to the kind of quiet heroism that never asks to be seen. Because Ghostwalker had done this before. For years he had stood between death and the lost. And now, at the edge of his own life, he had done it again, one last time, for a foal not his by blood, but his by choice. A final gesture in a life that had meant more than any of them could have imagined. And they knew deep in their bones that this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a legacy. The storm had begun to settle, but the cold wasn't going anywhere. It had sunk into the land itself, into the bones of the earth, and into the tired bodies of the men crouched in the snow. The makeshift shelter groaned softly under the weight of wind and ice, but it held. The foal, Luna, as Miguel had quietly started calling her, lay nestled beneath the warming blanket, her breaths now deeper, less shallow, the color beginning to return to her lips and ears. Her tiny legs twitched now and then, as if her body was remembering how to move. But her guardian, the one who had kept her heart beating through the worst of it, was fading fast. Ghostwalker's breath came slow, each one a labored draw, each rise and fall of his chest a reminder that his strength had limits. 22 winters in the wild had worn him thin, but this last act of devotion had taken the rest. Jake sat beside him now, quiet, his gloved hand resting on the stallion's neck. There was a strange peace in the old horse's eyes, not defeat, never that, but a kind of surrender that spoke of mission complete. His job was done, his foal was safe. The others worked quickly, but gently. Miguel mixed another bottle of milk replacer in the fade-in light, using melted snow and the last of their warm water. Luna drank from it with growing eagerness, her mouth moving with more energy than before. Jake could see her strength returning minute by minute. That spark of life, that will to fight. It had cost Ghostwalker everything, but now someone had to do what he no longer could. Jake stood slowly and looked toward the west, where the storm still crawled like a slow-moving beast across the plains. Somewhere beyond it, down winding ranch roads and snow-locked valleys, was town, and in town was the only person he trusted to understand what was happening here, not just to treat wounds, but to see the meaning behind them. "Tom," he said, voice rough, low, final. "You need to go." Tom blinked, startled. "Now?" "Yes. Drive, get to town, find Dr. Sarah Winters, tell her everything. Show her the pouch, the notes, tell her who he is. She's the only one who will understand what we're dealing with, and she'll come, storm or not." Tom hesitated only a moment longer before giving a tight nod. He gathered the papers, stuffed them into his coat, took the last 2 hand warmers, and jogged back toward the truck without another word. Within moments, the engine roared to life, and the headlights disappeared into a curtain of snow as thick as fog. Jake watched him go, then turned back to the tent, his face drawn but resolute. They would wait. They would keep the fire going, even if that fire was nothing more than body heat and willpower. Miguel stayed inside the tent with Luna, rubbing her legs gently to stimulate circulation, whispering soft Spanish phrases that echoed like lullabies in the cramped shelter. Outside, Jake reinforced the windbreak, stomping down the snow around the base to seal off drafts. He checked Ghostwalker again, kneeling beside him. The stallion's body was cool now. Not cold, not lifeless, but cool in a way that told Jake the heat was retreating. Slowly, irrevocably. Still, his eyes were open. Still, he watched Luna, Hours passed. Night fell. No word from Tom. No sound except the wind and the soft rustle of tarp. Then, from the far edge of the horizon, came a new sound. Low at first, faint but unmistakable. Engines, not just one, several. Jake stood up, heart pounding. Lights pierced the dark, headlights cutting through the white like blades. The first vehicle to break through was familiar. Sarah Winter's mobile vet unit, a reinforced truck built for exactly this kind of terrain and emergency. Behind it came 2 trucks bearing the symbol of the local wild horse sanctuary, and behind those, a wildlife rescue vehicle. The cavalry hadn't just come. They had brought an army. The moment the convoy came to a stop, Sarah was out of the cab and moving fast, her thick coat flapping behind her, eyes scanning the snow-covered scene until they landed on the tent. Jake stepped forward, met her halfway, and handed over the documents. She didn't need long. One look at the name, one glance at the stallion still curled beside the foal. "My God," she whispered, "it really is him." She moved with practiced speed, her team close behind. Inside the tent, she dropped to her knees beside Ghost Walker, her hands already moving across his hide, checking pulse, temperature, reflexes. "I've been documenting this horse for 15 years, she said, not even looking up. "He's the reason I got into this work. He's not just a stallion, he's a legend. The way he guards foals, his own, orphans, strays, it's unheard of. We've seen him do things no wild horse should even attempt. And now, here he is, still doing it, even now." Luna stirred again, her head lifted, her eyes finally opening all the way, soft, alert, golden brown. She looked directly at Ghost Walker and made a sound, small, curious, like a question. The stallion responded with the last strength he had. A nicker, faint but clear, a whisper of a goodbye. Their muzzles touched, barely brushing, but it was enough. Enough for Luna to know he was still there. Enough for the humans to know he had seen his job through to the very last breath. Sarah looked up, her voice tight with emotion. "We need to get them into the trailer. It's heated, insulated. She'll make it. He might not survive the trip, but if we keep him here, he'll slip away in the cold. If he has a chance, it's there." But Ghost Walker had other plans. As they spoke, the stallion began to move, slowly, trembling. He shifted his weight, lifted his front legs, struggled to rise. It was agonizing to watch. Miguel reached forward to steady him, but Jake held out an arm. Let him try. And he did. Ghost Walker stood, not tall, not proud, but upright, on shaky, unsteady legs. He turned his head, looked at Luna, and nudged her toward the humans. A gesture, a handoff. He was giving her to them, trusting them, not just with her care, but with her future. They moved fast after that. Sarah's team created a path to the trailer, using snow shovels to clear space. They carried Luna in a padded sling, wrapped tight in blankets. She didn't fight. She just watched them, her ears perked, her body beginning to recover. The trailer doors opened, revealing a stall prepped with hay, heat lamps, fresh water. She was placed inside. She lay down gently, blinking up at the light. Safe. Ghost Walker followed, but not all the way. Halfway to the trailer he paused, looked back. His legs buckled once, and he caught himself. His breath was shallow now, his strength nearly gone. But when he turned his head one last time and saw Luna looking back at him, alive, warm, protected, he stopped resisting. His eyes closed briefly, his body relaxed, and without a word, he sank gently to the snow, Jake, Sarah, and Miguel gathered around him, the wind picking up again. The sky above them cracked open with the first stars of night, cold and distant, but steady. They knelt beside Ghostwalker as Sarah checked his vitals again, tears on her cheeks. "He held on for her," she said, "and now he's letting go." And so they stayed, wrapped in silence, as the old stallion gave his final breath to the snow. It wasn't a failure. It wasn't even sorrow. It was a release. A hero who had completed his mission, who had left his legacy not in bloodlines, but in choices, and in a foal named Luna, now safe and warm and alive because of him. Dawn crept in slowly, painting the horizon in pale streaks of blue and silver, brushing frost-kissed light over a land that had endured a night unlike any other. The wind had finally quieted, retreating to a low whisper that rustled through the skeletal sagebrush and curled around the makeshift camp like a sigh. Ghostwalker lay in the snow, still and silent, but not abandoned, not forgotten. His body, battered and scarred, now rested in peace, surrounded by those who had witnessed his final act. Jake stood beside him, one hand resting on the stallion's withers, his breath visible in the frigid air. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everything that could be said about this horse, everything that mattered, had already been written in blood and snow and the soft warmth of the foal he had saved. Inside the trailer, Luna was awake, truly awake. Her eyes, once glazed with exhaustion and cold, now shone with curiosity. She had stood sometime during the early hours, weak and wobbly, but standing nonetheless. Miguel had been there to steady her, his hands gentle, guiding. She hadn't cried out, hadn't panicked. She had simply looked around, ears perked, legs trembling, and searched for the only presence that had ever made her feel safe. And when she hadn't seen Ghostwalker beside her, she had called for him, a soft, rising whinny that carried more weight than sound. It was the kind of cry that echoed into the hearts of every person standing nearby. Ghostwalker didn't answer, but something deeper did. As Luna stood there, alone, but not truly alone, the people who had once been strangers now surrounded her with purpose. Sarah stepped into the trailer, her voice low and soothing. She placed a hand on the foal's neck, feeling her pulse, the rise and fall of her tiny chest, the fire rekindled in her fragile body. "She's strong," she said softly, "a little miracle." But Jake, still outside, his boots planted firm in the snow beside the fallen stallion, felt the weight of it all settle onto his shoulders. The miracle hadn't just been the foal's survival, it had been the choices that made it possible. A stallion who had every reason to flee, every right to save himself, had instead made a stand against a storm and against time, and in doing so had given them all something they'd never expected to carry, a legacy. Sarah's team moved quietly now, their boots muffled by snow as they prepared a resting place for Ghostwalker. They had chosen the rise just above the tent site, a quiet, open patch of ground overlooking the plains. It was a place Ghostwalker himself had likely stood 100 times, watching his herd, scanning the horizon, protecting. They didn't speak much as they worked. The air demanded reverence. Jake and Miguel joined them, helping dig the grave by hand, pushing through frozen soil with shovels and picks, sweat forming under their layers despite the cold. Every strike of the blade into the earth felt like an offering. Every shovelful of dirt was a tribute. They laid him down gently, wrapped in a wool blanket from the trailer, his body curled the way he had slept beside Luna. A carved stone from the trailer was placed at the head, etched with one word: Guardian. No dates, no long inscription, just the truth. After the burial, Sarah stood at the edge of the grave and looked out across the land. He was the last of his kind, she said, a stallion who chose compassion over instinct, who gave up everything, not just for his own bloodline, but for the ones who had no one else. We study behavior, track herds, write papers, but nothing we ever write could explain this better than what we just saw with our own eyes. Miguel nodded slowly, his face drawn. He didn't just guard the foal, he guarded something more, something we almost never get to see, the soul of the wild. Back at the trailer, Luna paced gently now, gaining strength with every step. She would walk to the door, pause, glance toward the field where Ghost Walker had last stood, then turn back. Not afraid, not lost, just different, changed. Jake climbed into the trailer and watched her. She met his eyes and didn't look away. He saw it in her. The same fire, the same calm defiance. He reached out a hand, and instead of retreating, she stepped closer, brushing her nose softly against his fingers. Not because she needed him, but because she was ready. Tom returned later that afternoon, tired and dusted in frost, but safe. He had made it to town, rallied help, delivered the message. Now, seeing Ghost Walker's grave and Luna standing strong in the trailer, he simply lowered his head and placed a hand on the stone, lips pressed into a tight line. "You did it, old boy," he whispered. In the following hours, the sanctuary team made arrangements to transport Luna back to their facility. She would be placed in their care, given warmth, safety, food, and the company of other young horses. But something in her had already marked her as different. Already she watched over the smallest foals with a quiet protectiveness. When a nervous yearling cried out, Luna moved beside it. When a new colt stumbled, she stood between it and the others. It wasn't mimicry, it was memory, a lesson learned in snow and blood and silence. And so the story didn't end in that clearing. It began again, carried forward in every step Luna took, in every gesture of calm she showed, in every moment she chose to stand in the gap for someone smaller and more fragile than herself. Jake knew it the first time he saw her do it. "She's doing it," he said to Miguel, holding a coffee cup in both hands. "Already, she's doing what he did." Miguel nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off her. She remembers, not the storm, not the cold, but what saved her. They wouldn't forget either, none of them. Not the ranchers, not the sanctuary team, not Sarah or Tom. The grave on the hill would remain, marked by that single stone, and the story that would ripple out across the ranch lands for years to come. People would come and ask where Ghost Walker fell, where he made his final stand, and they would be told, not just about his age or his strength, but about the moment he chose to stop running, to lay down in the snow and wrap himself around a life smaller than his own, not out of instinct, not out of desperation, but because, somehow, he knew it was the right thing to do. And Luna, his legacy, was still walking, still growing, still guarding. A living monument to the stallion who chose love over survival and left behind something stronger than either. 3 months passed, and with each week that slipped by, the world seemed to spin just a little faster again. The storm became a memory, softened by time, dulled by distance, as all storms eventually do. But not for Jake, not for Miguel, not for Tom. The snow had melted, the winds had calmed, and spring had returned to the red desert, brushing color back into the earth. The grass returned in patches, stubborn and green. The fences stood tall again, repaired and reinforced. Calves were born, long rides resumed, and life carried on with its usual rhythm. But something in the hearts of those three men had shifted, deeply, permanently, because once you've looked a wild stallion in the eye as he lays down his life for a baby not his own, once you've knelt in the snow and watched that foal take her first independent breath because of him, you don't go back to life as usual. Not completely. Something stays with you. A quiet weight, a deeper understanding of courage, of loyalty, of love in its most primitive, unselfish form. Jake still thought about Ghostwalker almost every day. Sometimes at dawn, when the wind moved through the pasture just right, he could almost hear that last breath, that final strong whinny that the stallion gave before closing his eyes forever. Other times, it was when he'd walk past the ridge where the grave sat. The snow was long gone, but the stone remained, guardian, carved deep and clean into the rock like a promise. Wildflowers had started to grow around the site. Nobody planted them. They just appeared. Miguel said it was nature remembering. Jake liked that idea. Then one morning, a package arrived. No warning, no note. Just a small cardboard box from the sanctuary. Jake opened it slowly, carefully. Inside was a thumb drive and a letter. The letter was from the sanctuary director, a woman named Anne, whom they'd spoken with only briefly on the day Ghostwalker passed. Her words were simple but full of emotion. "We thought you'd want to see this. Luna is thriving. She's not just surviving, she's living, really living. And something remarkable has happened. Something we've never seen in a foal her age." Jake inserted the drive into the laptop on the kitchen table, the old one with the cracked hinge that only opened halfway now. He waited for the file to load, and when it did, the first image was of Luna standing in the center of a warm, sunlit paddock. She looked different now, bigger, stronger. Her coat glowed with health, a glossy, rich brown that rippled with every small movement. Her legs were steady, her head held high, her mane longer than it had been the last time they saw her. But it was her eyes that caught Jake, the same steady calm, the same quiet fire he'd seen in Ghostwalker's stare, passed down not by blood, but by choice. The video played on. Luna moved through the paddock with purpose, pausing near a small foal lying alone under a tree. This one was younger, barely old enough to stand. Nervous, an orphan recently brought into the sanctuary after its mother had died giving birth. Jake leaned forward as Luna approached the foal, slowly, gently, no aggression, no dominance. She stepped between the little one and the fence line, lowered her head, and stood still, guarding, just like Ghostwalker had done for her. The foal nuzzled at her side, unsure at first, then more confidently, and Luna didn't move, didn't flinch. She stayed, held her position, let the foal lean into her warmth as the wind picked up and dust kicked across the paddock. And when one of the sanctuary staff came in to check on them, Luna stepped forward, not to threaten, but to shield. She had drawn a line. This one, she had decided, was under her care. No one would harm it. No one would take it, not without her say-so. Jake hit pause and sat back in his chair, throat tight. He wiped at his eyes with the sleeve of his flannel shirt, blinked once, and then pressed play again. The next scene was later in the day. The sun was lower, the shadows longer. Luna now stood with two other foals near her, not one, two, both resting, both pressed against her. She stood like a statue between them and the rest of the world, eyes half closed, calm and strong and aware of everything, watching, always watching. Anne's voice picked up in the background of the clip. She's taken on a role no other young horse here has. She's become a sentinel. She positions herself by the gate every morning. She checks each new arrival. She chooses which ones need her. We don't assign her to them. She assigns herself. And they follow her. They trust her, like they know who she came from, like they understand her story, Ghost Walker's story. Jake didn't realize how long he'd been watching until the sun shifted through the window, casting a strip of light across the table. He closed the laptop and held the letter in his hand, reading the last line again. She's not just carrying his blood, she's carrying his purpose. He took the video to the barn later that evening, played it for Miguel and Tom over coffee, the three of them sitting in folding chairs surrounded by hay and horses and the low hum of evening chores. They didn't speak while the video played. They didn't need to. They just watched. And when it ended, when Luna stood tall in the final frame with her head turned toward the sky and a new foal asleep at her side, Jake finally exhaled and said, "She's become what he was." Tom nodded slowly. "Maybe even more." Miguel smiled. He taught her with no words, just love. The grave at the ridge became a quiet place of remembrance. Every so often, someone would leave something at the stone, a wildflower, a carved horse figurine. One day, a school group from a nearby town visited, guided by the sanctuary team. They brought a small plaque. It read, "Ghost Walker, Guardian of the Lost. He didn't run, he stayed." And as the years passed, Luna continued his work. She became a legend in her own right, not just as a survivor, but as a protector, as a teacher. She grew into a mare with the spirit of a stallion who had taught the world what it truly meant to sacrifice. She wasn't raised by him in the traditional sense, but she was shaped by him, forged in the storm under his chest, carried forward by his choice to love without condition. The sanctuary began calling her something new, not just Luna, but the Guardian's flame. Because Ghost Walker's fire hadn't died in the snow that night, he had passed it on, and she had carried it into the light,